If one were to do an Amazon search on the topic of Holocaust as of 2013, we would have a little bit over 17,000 books. And while there are 10 times that amount of cookbooks available, given the limited scope, 17,000 books written on this particular topic is quite impressive. A very superficial look at the titles, we can divide these books into three broad categories. The first are first-person accounts of how individuals were able to escape the horrors of the concentration camp. To the practicing Jew, the miraculous confluence of various forces would be a living example of the Yad Hashem in saving this particular individual from death. To the non-practicing Jew, these same events would be attributed to destiny or fate or just plain luck. Writing about the Holocaust for many is a therapeutic exercise. Others maintain that it is to alert the world to man's inhumanity to man, and as with World War I, the war to end all wars, writing about the Holocaust would hopefully eradicate man's inhumanity to man through ethnic cleansing. A second genre is one of analysis, and generally penned by the academics who lecture in Holocaust studies at the university level. And the purpose of this analysis is to find the basic facts, to explore the possible reasons why 5.8 million European Jews died under the Nazis. It requires sifting through evidence relating to the motives, the means, and opportunities that they had at their disposal. In the process, the authors raise some very vexatious and sharply contested questions, such as why was it a German government that perpetrated this mass murder? What led that government to the conclusion that all Jews had to die? Could the murder have been prevented, or at least the scale reduced, had the victims or the bystanders acted differently? And to raise the issue in the public arena as to whether such a Holocaust can happen again. These books very often are contentious and draw a great deal of criticism, particularly from those at whom the finger of responsibility is directed. A third genre deal with theology, in most cases written by people who have maintained their belief in God despite the Holocaust, and grapple with primarily the issue of faith after the Holocaust. The gold standard of this kind of writing is a book by Dr. Eliezer Berkowitz. The book unfortunately is now out of print and raises two separate questions, one on the micro level, the other on the macro level. On the micro level, the theological question and challenge as to why particular individuals, those who kept the faith, innocent children, had to face suffering for which they did not deserve. The theoretical grandfather and grandmother who were committed to Judaism, why should they have ended up in Auschwitz? And secondly, how can the Jewish people who were chosen by God to receive the Torah be subjected to such unparalleled debasement and humiliation? And in another review, the book is a wonderful answer to skeptics who use the example of the Holocaust as an excuse to criticize Judaism. This is a point that was mentioned earlier, where halachic Judaism is replaced with Holocaust Judaism. The question of God's place in human history is as old as human history itself. Contrasting the questions of the old against modern philosophies, he also shows how little the phraseology of the same old criticism has changed. This is precisely the line of thinking. At the other end of the spectrum, and wearing a very different set of glasses, we have a book written by Richard Rubinstein reflecting the position of the Reform movement, first printed in 1966 and revised in 1992, in which he postulates four theories. One, that the Holocaust shattered the main beliefs of traditional Judaism. Two, it's no longer possible to believe in an all-powerful, benevolent God who guides history. Three, it is no longer to believe in the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people. And four, Jews must learn to utilize power in order to survive. And hence, as with early Christianity, who used the Churban as evidence for the rejection of Pharisaic Judaism, so too the Reform movement has used the Churban of the 20th century in support of its rejection of halachic Judaism. He was a Jewish protagonist for the God is Dead movement. Most of the 4 points now seem quite antiquated and out of date, and hence, as of the republication in 1992, he adjusted some of his earlier views about God in light of the Kabbalah. There is no question that during and immediately following the war, the Holocaust would have put one's religious belief to the test. In 1946, there was the printing of an account of one Yossel Rakover, set in the Warsaw Ghetto, who just before the final days of the Warsaw Ghetto wrote a 14-page statement. It's central theme is that even during the most brutal times, when God's face is hidden and he seems unreachable and indifferent, the bond between God and the human being holds. It's a very moving account. Unfortunately, it was mistakenly reprinted in Israel as an authentic document discovered in the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto, but it does express the aspirations and feelings and responses of a religious Jew to the Holocaust, the supremacy of Torah and religion, despite an Auschwitz. And one final reference to the books of this genre, one that is part personal account, part theology, is Hasidic Tales of the Holocaust from Yafa Eliach, the first collection of stories about Jews who did not lose their faith during the Holocaust, at least most of them who didn't. Prior to the writing of this book, religious Jews in the Holocaust were portrayed in the media as cowards who didn't fight back, rather than the religious martyrs that they were. Most typical of this anti-religious period is the infamous line from the movie version of Leon Uris's book, "The only God I believe in is a gun." The Hasidim of Poland, however, had a different view of their suffering during the Holocaust. God had not deserted them, even if, on the surface at least, he seems hidden in the time of darkness. And the reviewer goes on to point out that courage, as this book demonstrates, doesn't always mean grabbing a gun. It can also mean hiding a child, sharing your food when you yourself are starving, or meeting death with your human dignity intact. To maintain one's faith under such adversity, to continue studying Torah and doing the mitzvot even in a concentration camp, these were acts of true resistance that shine through every page of this book. And this basically is the theme of the religious response to the Shoah, and one that will be developed by the Rebbe in the remainder of the